Chapter 1, Family and Dreams. I was born in the city of York, England, in 1632. My father was from Germany, and my mother was English. In our family, I had two older brothers and a younger sister. My oldest brother joined the army, but sadly, he was killed in battle. My other brother left home one day and disappeared. We never found out what happened to him. I was lucky to receive a good education, and my father hoped I would study law and become a lawyer. But my heart wanted something else. I dreamed of going to sea and exploring the world. Nothing could stop me from wanting this adventure. When I turned 18, my father, who was old and often sick, called me to his room. He lay in bed and looked at me with tired eyes. "Why do you want to go to sea?" he asked gently. "You can stay here, study, and have a good life in your own country." He warned me about the dangers of traveling by sea. He said I would lose the safety and comfort of home. He reminded me of my older brother who had died. Tears filled his eyes, and he could not continue speaking. Hearing my father's words made me think hard. Maybe he was right. For a short time, I decided to forget about going to sea. But my desire didn't disappear. A week passed, and I spoke to my mother. I told her how much I wanted to see the world. I begged her to talk to my father for me. I promised that if I didn't like life at sea, I would return home and work hard. But my mother disagreed. She also didn't want me to leave. Another year went by. I stayed home, but I couldn't stop thinking about the sea. I felt torn between following my parents' wishes or chasing my own dreams. Chapter 2, The Journey Begins. One day in September, I visited the town of Hull. There, I met a friend whose father owned a ship. He told me he was sailing to London and invited me to join him, for free. I didn't think twice. I didn't prepare, and I didn't tell my parents. I stepped onto that ship on a cool September day. As the ship left the river and entered the open sea, I felt a rush of excitement. But soon, trouble began. Strong winds shook the ship, and the sea turned wild. A storm was coming, and I quickly realized this journey might not be as easy as I had imagined. As the ship sailed further into the sea, fear gripped me. The waves crashed against the sides, and the wind howled around us. I felt sick, and the rocking of the ship made everything worse. I sat in a corner, holding onto the rail, feeling miserable. I regretted my decision to leave home. Every time the ship tilted, I thought it was going to sink. If I survive this, I told myself, I will go straight home. I'll apologize to my parents and never think about the sea again. By morning, the storm had passed. The sea was calm, but I still felt seasick. I couldn't stop thinking about the terrible night I had just experienced. Later that day, the weather turned pleasant. The sun set beautifully over the water, and the sea looked peaceful, as if nothing had happened. One of the sailors noticed me sitting alone and came over. He smiled and made a few jokes to cheer me up. "Well, young man," he said, laughing. "What do you think of that little wind from last night?" I looked at him in disbelief. "Little wind?" I asked. "I thought we were going to die." He laughed even harder and handed me a drink. "Here, take this. It'll help you feel better." I drank more than I should have, and soon I felt warm and relaxed. That night, I slept deeply and peacefully for the first time since boarding the ship. When I woke up the next morning, I felt like a new person. The fear I had felt during the storm seemed distant, almost like a bad dream. I laughed at myself for being so scared. instead of thinking about going home, I felt excited again about life at sea. The thrill of adventure filled my heart. For the next few days, the wind was against us, and the ship didn't move much. But I didn't mind. I spent my time on deck, watching the horizon and imagining all the places I might visit. On the third day, the wind picked up, and the ship began to move faster. I stood at the bow, feeling the breeze on my face, and smiled. I had forgotten my fear. The sea was calling me, and I was ready for whatever came next. The next day, a terrible storm struck. This time, I wasn't the only one afraid. I could see the fear on the faces of the sailors. Even the most experienced men looked worried. The captain paced in and out of his cabin, his lips moving in quiet prayer. The sight of him praying made my heart sink. If the captain was scared, how could I not be? I lay in my bed, frozen with fear, hoping the storm would pass. But when I peeked out of the small window in my cabin, my fear grew even stronger. The waves outside were as tall as mountains. I watched helplessly as other ships were tossed around like toys, their masts swaying dangerously. Suddenly, one of the sailors shouted, "A ship has gone under!" He cried. I rushed to the window and saw the ocean swallowing a nearby ship. It disappeared beneath the waves in seconds. Terror gripped me. I regretted not going home after the first storm. If I had returned then, I would have been safe with my family. Now, I feared it was too late. The storm grew worse. The wind roared, and the rain lashed against the deck. The sailors, usually so strong and confident, were now praying loudly, asking God to save us. Suddenly, someone screamed, "There's a hole in the ship. Water is coming in." Panic spread quickly. The captain ordered everyone to help pump the water out. But I couldn't move. I lay in my bed, shaking with fear. A sailor ran into my cabin and grabbed my arm. "Get up!" he shouted. "We need every man to help, or we're all going down." I forced myself to stand and followed him below deck. The crew worked frantically, passing buckets and pumping water. I joined them, pumping with all my strength. Above us, I heard the captain order someone to fire a gun. The loud blast echoed through the storm. It was a signal for help, a desperate call to any nearby ship. I thought the ship was sinking. Water filled the lower deck, and I felt sure we wouldn't survive. We worked for hours, exhausted but determined. Slowly, the storm began to calm, but the damage was done. The ship had been battered and bruised, and we were far from safe. The captain continued firing the ship's guns, hoping someone would hear our cries for help. After some time, a small ship appeared in the distance. The sailors on that ship bravely sent a small boat to rescue us. The men in the boat fought against the powerful waves, risking their lives to reach us. At last, they managed to come alongside our sinking ship. "Get in, quickly!" one of them shouted. We climbed down carefully, holding tightly to the ropes as the storm tossed the boat up and down. It was too dangerous to return to their ship, which was already far away. Instead, we decided to head for the coast. 15 minutes after we left, I watched in horror as our ship sank beneath the waves. It disappeared into the dark sea, leaving only broken wood floating on the surface. Though we were safe in the boat, fear still filled my heart. The storm was calming, but I could not stop shaking. Soon, we saw the coast ahead. A group of people was waiting for us on the beach. As we drew closer, I saw their kind faces and felt a little relief. When we finally reached the shore, they helped pull the boat onto the beach. They gave us warm clothes, food, and a place to rest. Their kindness made me feel grateful, and I realized how lucky we were to be alive. The local people even gave us money to travel back to Hull or continue to London. I decided to go to London. As I traveled to London by land, I thought about what had happened. I wondered if I should return home to my parents. But I felt too ashamed. I couldn't bear to face them and admit my failure. In London, I met the captain of another ship. He was planning a trip to Africa and offered me a place on his crew. "You can learn a lot on this journey," he told me. Before we left, he gave me advice on what goods to buy for trade in Africa. I didn't have much money, only £40, but I used it to buy what I could. The trip was a success. I returned to England with gold worth nearly £300. The journey was important not just because I made money, but because the captain taught me valuable skills. I learned about navigation, trading, and the basics of being a sailor. Shortly after we returned to England, the captain who had mentored me passed away. His death saddened me, but I was determined to continue. I decided to make the same journey to Africa with the same ship, now under the command of a new captain. Once again, I felt the pull of the sea, and my adventure was far from over. At first, the journey to Africa went smoothly. The sun shone brightly, and the sea was calm. I felt confident and excited about the adventure ahead, but our luck didn't last long. One morning, as I stood on the deck, a sailor shouted, "Ship on the horizon." At first, we thought nothing of it. But as the day went on, the ship came closer. Soon, we realized the terrible truth. It was a pirate ship. "They've been chasing us since morning," the captain said grimly. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the pirates were almost alongside us. They fired their weapons and tried to board our ship. We fought back as best as we could. For a moment, it seemed like we had driven them away. But the pirates didn't give up. The second attack was much worse. This time, the pirates managed to climb onto our ship. They stormed the deck, shouting and waving their weapons. A fierce battle broke out. I saw some of our sailors fall, injured or worse. We tried to defend ourselves, but the pirates were too strong. Furniture was smashed, and barrels were thrown overboard. The pirates destroyed everything they could find. After heavy losses, we had no choice but to surrender. I stood quietly, my heart pounding, as the pirates tied our hands and took control of the ship. We were now their prisoners, and I wondered what fate awaited us. Chapter 3, Life as a Slave. I was young and strong, and because of that, I became a slave to the pirate captain. Life as a slave was hard and lonely. Sadness followed me everywhere. I often hoped the captain would take me along when he sailed. I dreamed that one day, a Spanish or Portuguese ship might attack, and I could escape during the battle, but that hope faded quickly. The captain left me behind every time he went to sea. My job was to take care of his garden and look after the house. One day, while working near the house, I met a young woman. She was beautiful, with kind eyes and a warm smile. Like me, she was a slave. Her job was to clean the house. I tried to talk to her, but she didn't speak my language. Still, I felt that she understood me without words. She smiled whenever she saw me. And sometimes, when we passed by each other, she would touch my hand for just a moment. Those small touches made my heart race. I liked her very much. She was often on my mind, and thinking of her brought happiness to my heart. I realized I was falling in love with her, but our situation was difficult. Slaves weren't allowed to have relationships. If the captain saw us, he could punish us, or worse, send her away. Sometimes, when the captain went fishing, he took me and a young boy with him. On other days, he sent me and the boy alone with one of his relatives. Those fishing trips gave me small moments of freedom. Out on the sea, with the wind in my hair and the sun on my face, I could almost forget I was a slave, but even during those peaceful times, the image of the woman in the house stayed in my mind. I longed to see her again, even if just for a few moments. One morning, while we were out fishing, a thick fog rolled in over the water. The sea became a vast, endless gray, and we couldn't see the shore. For hours, we struggled to find our way back. The fog made everything look the same. And no matter which direction we sailed, the coast seemed to disappear. We drifted through the night, cold and exhausted. It wasn't until the next morning, when the sun rose and burned away the fog, that we finally found our way home. After that frightening experience, the captain decided we needed a better boat. He took the one from the English ship, the ship I had been captured on, and made some changes. The boat was larger and had a small cabin in the middle, making it more comfortable. It was also equipped with good sails and better navigation tools. I could tell the captain was proud of the boat. One day, the captain asked me to load the boat with extra food, drinks, and guns. He told me important guests would be joining him for a fishing and hunting trip. I did as he asked, preparing the boat carefully. Everything was ready. But at the last moment, the guests cancelled. The captain looked disappointed. "Well," he said, "we'll use the boat for fishing tomorrow instead." As he walked away, an idea struck me. This was my chance to escape. The boat was already stocked with everything I needed: food, water, and weapons. I just had to wait for the right moment. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought of the young woman in the house. I wanted to take her with me, but I had no idea how. It wasn't possible to bring her on the boat without being caught. I felt a heavy sadness in my heart, but I knew I had to leave. I promised myself that if I ever found freedom, I would try to return for her one day. That night, I couldn't sleep. My heart felt heavy. I longed for freedom, but I couldn't stop thinking about her, the young woman in the house. I lay awake, torn between escaping and staying just to be near her. When morning finally came, I hoped for one thing: to see her, even if only for a moment. I couldn't leave without saying goodbye. Without looking into her eyes one last time, as I walked past the house, there she was. The sun cast a soft glow on her face, and she looked more beautiful than ever. Our eyes met. She seemed to sense something was wrong. Maybe she knew this would be our last moment together. For a long second, neither of us spoke. Then, she slowly reached out and touched my hand. Her fingers were warm, but her face was filled with sadness. I felt the same. She gave me a soft, gentle smile, the kind that made my heart ache, and then turned away, disappearing into the house. That was the last time I ever saw her. Chapter 4, The Escape Begins. An hour later, the boat was ready. The boy and I climbed aboard, along with one of the captain's relatives. He was in charge that day. As we sailed away from the shore, I felt the weight of what I was about to do. The land grew smaller behind us, and I wondered if she was watching from the house. I pretended I couldn't catch any fish, fumbling with the nets and hooks. "Let's sail further out," the captain's relative said. "We'll find better waters there." I nodded, quietly steering the boat further from the coast. Each passing wave carried me closer to freedom, and further away from the woman I loved. The wind was strong, and we sailed further from the shore. Our boss stood at the front of the boat, watching the horizon. This was my chance. Without hesitation, I rushed forward and pushed him into the sea. He splashed into the water, shouting and trying to swim back to the boat. I grabbed one of the guns and aimed it at him. "Swim back to the coast if you want to live," I shouted. He looked at me, fear in his eyes. After a moment, he turned and began swimming toward the distant shore. I watched him until he disappeared from view. I turned to the boy, who stared at me wide-eyed and silent. "You must promise to be faithful to me," I said. "If you do, we will both be free." He nodded quickly and swore his loyalty. After 2 long years as a slave, I was finally free. We sailed as fast as we could, the wind pushing us further from the pirate land. By the next day, I could no longer see the coast behind us. But fear still filled me. I was terrified the pirates might chase after us. I didn't allow the boy to stop the boat for 5 days. We kept moving, day and night, until I felt sure we were safe. On the 6th day, I began to feel more at ease. We spotted land in the distance and slowly brought the boat closer. A small river flowed into the sea, and I knew we had to stop to collect fresh water, but I was cautious. "We wait until nightfall," I told the boy. "We'll swim to shore unseen and gather water then." As the sun set and darkness covered the land, I felt ready. But just as we prepared to swim, strange and terrifying noises echoed from the beach. Growls and roars filled the air. The boy grabbed my arm. "Please, let's stay on the boat," he whispered. I nodded reluctantly. The sounds grew louder, and neither of us could sleep. 2 hours later, we saw movement along the shore. Large animals came down to the river, washing and drinking. Their growls and howls were even more frightening up close. The boy trembled beside me. Then, to our horror, one of the animals began swimming toward the boat. "Let's sail away," the boy begged, but I knew we couldn't leave. We needed water to survive. I grabbed a gun and aimed at the creature. I fired, and the sound echoed over the water. The bullet missed, but the animal quickly turned and swam back to the shore. The boy let out a sigh of relief. We stayed in the boat that night, listening to the sounds of the wild, waiting for dawn and another chance to find safety. The loud gunshot scared the other animals away. The terrifying noises faded, and the night grew quiet, but fear still clung to us. Neither of us dared leave the boat until morning. As the first light stretched across the sky, we felt a little braver. We ate some dry bread for breakfast and decided it was finally time to go ashore. With our guns in hand and 2 large bottles for water, we carefully stepped onto the beach. I didn't want to lose sight of the boat, so I stayed near the shore. "Go a little further in," I told the boy. "Find fresh water, but don't go too far." He nodded and hurried off. For a while, I waited by the boat, watching the calm sea. Suddenly, I saw the boy running back toward me. My heart raced. I thought something dangerous was chasing him, but as he got closer, I realized he wasn't afraid, he was excited. In his hand, he held a large bird, one that looked like a wild chicken. "I caught this," he said, breathless. I laughed with relief. The bird meant fresh meat for the first time in days. We filled our bottles with cool, fresh water and returned to the boat. I had no idea where we were. I only knew we were somewhere along the coast of Africa, sailing slowly along the shoreline. I prayed that one day we might meet an English ship. If we could flag them down, we would be saved, but day after day, the coast remained empty. No people, no ships, just wild animals and endless land. Chapter 5, The Lion Attack. One morning, as we set off to gather water, the boy tugged at my sleeve and pointed ahead. "Look there," he whispered. under the shade of a tree, a huge lion lay sleeping. We stopped in our tracks, not daring to make a sound. But the breeze shifted, and the lion opened his eyes. The moment he saw us, he stood up and started running toward us. "Shoot!" I shouted to the boy, but fear froze him in place. His hands shook, and he couldn't lift his gun. I grabbed my rifle. I had 3 bullets. The first shot hit the lion's leg, slowing him down. The second struck his head, and he stumbled. For the next 10 days, we sailed close to the land, stopping only to fill our bottles with fresh water. As we continued, I began to notice signs of life. A few times, we saw people on the shore, watching us from a distance. I felt a strange pull to approach them, but the boy urged me not to. "They may not be friendly," he warned. One day, however, we saw a group of people on the beach who looked different from the others. They didn't appear hostile. I waved at them, hoping to communicate. I signaled that we needed food, and to my surprise, they waved back and gestured for us to come to the shore. 2 of them ran into the forest, disappearing from sight for a while. When they returned, they had dried meat in their hands, but we didn't want to approach the shore, and they seemed too afraid to swim to us. There was no way to get the food without risking our safety. Seeing our hesitation, the people stepped back, moving further from the food. This gave us the chance to approach. We slowly sailed closer, took the dried meat, and returned to our boat. At last, we felt safe. The people watched from the shore, and we waved to thank them, but we had nothing to offer in return. Just as we began to feel more comfortable, something unexpected happened. From the hill, 2 animals appeared, running towards the people. The group of people screamed in fear. Before I could think, one of the animals attacked a young girl. I grabbed my gun, aimed, and fired. The shot echoed through the air, and the animal fell to the ground. The second animal, terrified by the sound of the gun, fled into the forest. The people were stunned, staring at the fallen animal in shock. They had never heard a gunshot before, and they looked terrified of us. But I knew we had saved them. When the people saw that the animal was dead and the girl was safe, they rejoiced. The young girl, who had been attacked, was alive, and they thanked us with sincere gratitude. To show their appreciation, they brought us more food and water. On the 11th day, we saw a long stretch of land extending far into the sea, with several small islands scattered far beyond. I considered sailing toward the islands, curious about what we might find there, but then the boy suddenly shouted, "Look, a ship!" I squinted into the distance. There, far on the horizon, was a ship. The boy was scared, thinking it might be a pirate ship, but when I looked carefully, I saw it was a Portuguese ship. The ship was moving away from us, and no one had noticed us yet. I quickly grabbed my gun and fired a shot into the air. The sound of the gunshot caught their attention. They turned the ship towards us, and soon we were safely aboard the Portuguese ship. The sailors on board spoke Portuguese, Spanish, and French, but I didn't understand any of those languages. Fortunately, a Scottish sailor approached us and offered to help. I explained our story to him, and he passed the message along to the crew. The sailors, now aware of our situation, welcomed us warmly. They agreed to take both the boy and me aboard their ship. We were overjoyed and relieved. We offered our belongings to the captain as thanks, but he refused to accept them. Instead, he insisted on paying for them, which was very kind of him. I offered the captain our boat, giving him a fair price for it. I only asked for half of what it was worth, and I offered the rest of our items for free. The captain agreed to the deal, and we were happy with the exchange. However, the captain also wanted to train the boy as a sailor. I wasn't sure about this idea. The boy was still so young, and I thought he deserved freedom, not another form of service. He had already been through so much, and I didn't want him to be trapped in another life of hardship. The captain insisted that it would be good for the boy to work for him, and the boy himself wanted to become a sailor. Eventually, I agreed. The ship was on its way to Brazil, and after 22 days, we arrived. I said goodbye to the boy and the sailors, and stepped onto the land of Brazil. Brazil was a new country in South America, and many people were starting fresh lives there, just like me. I didn't know anyone, but soon, I met people who owned sugar plantations, and they became my friends. I grew to love Brazil. I learned the language and felt more at home every day. I had some money from the captain and used it to buy a small piece of land. I started a sugar plantation, at first. My business didn't produce much, but over time, my plantation grew quickly. I was still single, but my life was good. I felt independent, and my finances steadily improved. In Brazil, we only paid small taxes, and the society was new, so there weren't many strict rules from the government. As my business grew, I had enough money to hire someone to clean my house. I asked my friends if they knew of any good women who could help. One of my friends told me, "I have a daughter who is 18 years old. I think she could work for you. She's also a very good cook." The next day, his daughter came to my house. She was friendly but a little shy, and she was also very beautiful. We talked briefly about what I needed. And she agreed to help. She came to my house the next day. She cleaned the floors, took out the trash, and tidied up the furniture. She came every Monday and Thursday, working for about 4 hours each time. She not only cleaned but also cooked for me. She even fed my cat, who started to get a little fat from all the attention and food. I felt content with my life in Brazil, and this new chapter seemed to be leading me towards something brighter. Chapter 6, a new chapter of love and marriage. I was always happy to see the girl. Sometimes, we had breakfast or lunch together, and we enjoyed our conversations. But one week, she became sick and couldn't come to my house. I felt a strange emptiness when she wasn't around. I realized that I really missed her, and I started to think that maybe I was in love with her. A week later, she came back to my house, and I was overjoyed to see her. I could tell she was happy too. Without thinking much, I hugged her, and we shared a long, passionate kiss. 2 weeks later, I decided to ask her father for permission to marry his daughter. I went to his house, feeling nervous but hopeful. I asked him. And after a long silence, he finally said, "I agree." I was the happiest man in the world. 2 months later, I married the daughter of my friend. Our life together began, and we started planning for a future as a family. Our plantation was growing, but we needed a bigger house, and more money. To build it, I thought about expanding my business in Africa. I knew I could make a lot of money there, and I shared the idea with my friends. They, too, became interested in the opportunity. The future seemed full of endless possibilities. One day, 3 of my friends came to visit me at my house. They told me they were planning to go to Africa and asked if I wanted to join them. Without hesitation, I said yes. I was excited for the adventure, so we began preparing for the journey. Soon, we were ready to set off. I said goodbye to my wife, promising to return in 2 months, and we started our journey. Our ship was very large, but there were only 17 of us on board. The ship was packed with goods for trade, cups, mirrors, knives, and many other items. At the beginning of our journey, the weather was beautiful but very hot. However, after a week, a powerful hurricane appeared, threatening our ship. For the next 12 days, we struggled through the storm. When it finally passed, we realized we had drifted far off course and were near the northern part of Brazil, close to the Orinoco River. The ship had suffered significant damage, and we couldn't continue our journey to Africa. The captain suggested returning to fix the ship, but I disagreed. After reviewing the maps, we decided that the best course of action would be to sail to Barbados to repair the ship, but before we could even reach Barbados, a second hurricane struck. The wind was so strong, and the waves so large, that we feared for our lives. The ship eventually ran aground in shallow water. And we could hear the creaking of the wood as we expected it to break apart at any moment. In a panic, we all climbed into the small boat that the ship carried. The boat was overcrowded with all 17 of us and had no sail. The waves were towering over us, and the wind howled like a wild beast. Our situation seemed hopeless, but we had no choice but to hold on and pray for our survival. The wind was relentless, pushing us toward a group of enormous rocks. We knew that a crash was inevitable. Suddenly, a massive wave appeared, and the boat was overturned. I was submerged in water, struggling to breathe. Everything around me went dark, and I couldn't see the others or the boat, as I was tossed in the waves. I spotted a small beach between the rocks. The next wave carried me toward it, and I was barely conscious, my body filled with water. I could feel the solid ground beneath me, but I could barely move. Despite my exhaustion, I forced myself to crawl further onto the land. I didn't want to be carried back into the sea. Before I could get to my feet, another wave came, pulling me back into the water. For a moment, I couldn't breathe, but the sea threw me back onto the shore. Struggling, I managed to crawl further away from the water, about 10 meters inland. I collapsed onto the beach, completely drained, and lay there for a long time. After some time, I managed to stand up, looking around for the others. But there was no sign of them. I was alone. I was the only person alive. My friends were gone. All I could find were 3 hats and 2 shoes scattered on the beach. The weather was still dreadful, but the waves had calmed. From where I stood, I could see the ship, far out in the distance, stranded on the water. I realized that I had almost nothing left. I was wet, without any extra clothes. No food or water, and no means of defending myself if an animal attacked. It was a nightmare, and I was alone in a foreign land, stranded with nothing. Chapter 7, The Island Survival. When I checked my pockets, I found only a knife and a small box of tobacco. My situation was dire. How could I possibly survive with just these items? Determined to stay alive, I explored the island before sunset, hoping to find something that could help. Eventually, I found a small river with fresh water, a small relief in the face of my dire circumstances. I fashioned a simple weapon from a short stick, hoping to protect myself against any dangerous animals. As night fell, I decided to spend it high up in a tree, away from potential threats. I managed to fall into an uneasy sleep, and when I woke the next morning, the sea had calmed. To my surprise, the ship, which had been far out at sea, had drifted closer to the rocks where I had nearly perished the night before. Realizing the ship was now within reach, I stripped off my wet clothes and swam toward it. Once there, I found no obvious way to get on board, but as I swam around the ship, I spotted a rope hanging from one side. I grabbed it and climbed up. On deck, I began to search for food and tools, knowing that they would be crucial for my survival. I was fortunate to find dry food on board, biscuits, which I stuffed into my pockets as I continued my search. I even found a bottle of rum which I took with me. However, there was no boat left on the ship, and I needed one to carry my supplies to the shore. Using some boards, I built a makeshift raft. To my luck, I discovered 3 large wooden boxes, which I loaded onto the raft, preparing for my journey back to the island. The ship had offered me a brief respite, but now I had to face the next challenge, survival on the island with the tools I had gathered. Chapter 8, The Island Discovery. I filled the first box with bread, cheese, and meat I had found on the ship, along with some more bottles of alcohol, which would be useful for later. As I was organizing the supplies on the raft, I suddenly heard a noise. My heart skipped a beat. Who could it be? It wasn't possible for any of my friends to still be alive, they had all perished. Cautiously, I approached the source of the noise, and to my surprise, it wasn't a person, it was a dog. The dog belonged to our captain. I couldn't believe it, but in that moment, I felt a sense of relief. I wasn't completely alone anymore. The dog became my companion in this lonely place, as I turned my attention back to my supplies. I noticed that the tide was rising. The clothes I had left on the beach were now in the water. I quickly searched the ship for more clothes and found a box containing tools. I also stumbled upon a beautiful carpet, which I decided to keep. Then, I began looking for weapons to protect myself and hunt for food. I was fortunate to find 4 guns and 3 boxes of gunpowder, 2 of which were dry. I loaded everything onto the raft and made my way back to the beach. I found bags of nails, 7 guns with bullets, and more gunpowder. I also took all the clothes I could find, as well as bed frames that I thought could be of use. Once everything was secured, I brought it back to the beach. This became my routine. Every day, I made the journey to the ship, bringing back anything that could help me survive. On my 3rd trip, I gathered ropes and sails, and on subsequent trips, I found more supplies, bread, rum, and even some sugar. One day, while exploring the ship further, I discovered a drawer filled with scissors, knives, forks, and some European and Brazilian coins. Although I knew the money was useless on the island, I took it anyway, as I never knew when it might become valuable. I also found a deck of playing cards adorned with pictures of kings and queens. I tucked these into my bag, knowing they would provide me with some small entertainment in my isolation. Each day felt like a battle for survival, but I was slowly building a foundation for a more comfortable life on this deserted island. Chapter 9, A Better Shelter. I thought I might have some fun with the playing cards I'd found, but I was more focused on survival. It was my 12th visit to the ship when I went there the next day, only to find dark clouds gathering in the sky and the wind picking up. I knew it was futile to make another raft with a storm approaching, so I quickly swam back to the beach. That night, the wind howled fiercely, but I was safe inside my little tent, feeling the security of the shelter I'd managed to create. The following morning, I awoke to a shocking sight: the ship was gone. It had either drifted away or been destroyed by the storm, and with it, my last hope of escaping the island. I realized I needed to focus on making a better place for myself, one where I could be more comfortable and, above all, safer. I could stay on this island for a long time, so I needed a place to live that would meet several important criteria. Once I arrived, I set out to find a place to settle. A hill caught my eye in the distance, and I thought that from its peak, I might get a better sense of where I was. I took a gun and some gunpowder and began my ascent. at the top of the hill, I had a panoramic view of the surrounding landscape. To my dismay, I realized I was stranded on an island. The sea surrounded the entire area. I could see two small islands, one to the north and the other to the west. To the south, I saw a large landmass, approximately 100 kilometers away. To the east, however, all I saw was the vast, empty ocean. There was no sign of civilization, just wild animals roaming the land. I was alone, and the island felt more like a prison than a sanctuary. But I had to make the best of it, knowing that my survival depended on the resources I could gather and the ingenuity I could muster. On my way back from the hill, I saw many birds flying around, none of which I recognized. Desperate for food, I shot one, but its meat wasn't edible. I returned to the raft, where I spent the rest of the day hauling the boxes and other discoveries further inland, trying to protect them from the harsh elements. As I worked, a thought kept circling in my mind: I had to go back to the ship. There was so much more there that could be useful, and with the unpredictable storms, the ship could break apart at any time. Before nightfall, I decided to set up a temporary shelter for the night. I crafted a rudimentary tent from the materials I had and stored everything that could be destroyed by rain or the sun inside. I placed my clothes on the ground to sleep on and positioned 4 guns around me for protection. I was exhausted from the day's work, and the moment I lay down, sleep quickly took over. The next day, I left my clothes in the tent and swam back to the ship. On board, I built a second raft and began collecting more useful items. The shelter had to be close to fresh water, shielded from the harsh sun, and secure from both animals and potential visitors. Most importantly, it had to offer a view of the sea so I could spot any passing ships. After some searching, I found a perfect spot next to a steep hill. The hill offered natural protection on one side, and I built a fence on the other 3 sides for extra security. There was no door to my shelter, but I made use of a short ladder that allowed me to climb over the fence, which I would then bring inside with me. I set up 2 tents in this area, a small one for sleeping and a larger one to store my belongings and keep me out of the elements. It was not luxurious, but it was as safe and comfortable as I could make it under the circumstances. I felt more at home now, and for the first time in a while, I allowed myself to believe that I could survive on this island, no matter how long it took for someone to find me. The larger tent housed the smaller one, where I lived, and it protected my food and gunpowder from the rain. Inside the smaller tent, I tried to make life as comfortable as I could. I spent most of my days working on various tasks to improve my situation, and one of my biggest projects was the cave at the bottom of the hill. I began digging and transporting stones and earth from the cave to reinforce the inner side of the fence, creating a terrace. The plan was to use the cave as a cellar, a safe place to store food and supplies. One day, while working on the cave, the sky darkened unexpectedly, and a storm began to brew. The lightning was blinding, followed by deafening thunder. I suddenly realized the danger I was in. The storm could strike one of the boxes of gunpowder I had stored, destroying everything and possibly killing me. Panic gripped me, but I knew I had to act quickly. As soon as the storm passed, I hurried to open the big boxes of gunpowder. I spent the next 3 days dividing the powder into smaller bags and boxes, then carefully hiding them in the rocks to ensure they were safe from any future lightning strikes. Each day, I also hunted. It was a necessary break from the grueling work, and the fresh meat was essential for my survival. In time, I began to learn more about the island's inhabitants, mostly wild animals, but I discovered a group of goats that became a regular source of meat. Despite my successes, there were days when sadness overcame me. I missed my wife terribly. I thought about my friends back in Brazil and my parents, and I couldn't help but feel the weight of loneliness. Living alone on this island seemed meaningless at times. I often walked along the beach, reflecting on the decisions that had led me here, regretting my choice to travel by sea. It was hard to ignore the feeling that I had lost everything, and at times, I doubted whether I would ever find my way back to a life that felt full again. Chapter 10, The Cross and the Shift in Perspective. I had come to realize that traveling by sea could change a person's life in profound ways. It could be an incredible adventure, or it could be a disaster. I knew my friends from the ship were gone, and the thought of their deaths haunted me. But despite everything, I was still alive, and for that, I was deeply grateful. I was also fortunate to have the tools, food, clothes, and guns from the ship. Without them, I wouldn't have lasted a week. In an attempt to mark my time and give my days structure, I decided to create a large cross on the beach near the spot where I had first arrived. I carved into it the date of my arrival, September 30th, 1659. The cross became my calendar, a way to keep track of the days and weeks. Each day, I would make a small cut in the cross, and the seventh cut was longer, marking the end of the week. The beginning of each month was marked by an even longer cut, a visual reminder of the passing of time. One day, while reflecting on my situation, I realized I had been consumed by negative thoughts. This wasn't healthy, and I knew I had to change my mindset. To shift my perspective, I made a list of both the good and the bad things that had happened to me. On the bad side, I was stranded on a deserted island with little hope of returning to civilization. But on the good side, I had survived the storm that claimed my friends' lives, I had food, and I had a dog who understood commands and kept me company. This list helped me see that even in the darkest situations, there could be something good. Every bad thing seemed to come with some form of silver lining. With this new mindset, I decided to focus on the positive aspects of my life. I worked tirelessly to improve my living conditions, making my cave larger to give me more space and better organization for all my supplies. The cave became my sanctuary, a place where I could feel some semblance of order and comfort amidst the chaos of my solitude. With my living space now a bit more organized, I started to make furniture, realizing that I needed a chair and a table to make my life easier. I used the boards from the rafts and the shipwreck to create these essential pieces. Next, I built shelves inside the cave to store my tools, clothes, and guns. It was satisfying to see everything neatly arranged, and for the first time in a long while, my cave felt like home. It was comfortable, orderly, and everything was within easy reach. As I worked, I decided to write a book. I needed a way to express my thoughts, and writing seemed like a good way to do so. I began documenting my daily life on the island, starting with my very first day and continuing to the present. I recorded the interesting, and sometimes important, events that shaped my time here. This helped me process my emotions and thoughts, and it gave me something productive to focus on. I also decided to organize my daily routine. Every morning, I walked for a few hours to keep my body active. Afterward, I worked until noon, then took a break for lunch. I would nap for a couple of hours before returning to work in the afternoon. This schedule helped structure my days and kept me from feeling too overwhelmed. I was expanding my cave, hoping it would serve as my kitchen, living room, bedroom, and cellar all in one. However, just as I was finishing up the cave, disaster struck. A large quantity of earth fell from one side of the cave. nearly collapsing it. I was terrified. It could have killed me if I had been inside. After the scare, I spent the next week working to stabilize the cave. I reinforced the sides and the ceiling with long boards to prevent a similar disaster from happening again. Little by little, I was turning my cave into a safer, more livable space. I continued arranging the furniture in my new home over the next 3 days. The weather was bad, with rain falling day and night, but it was still warm, so I kept myself busy with tasks inside. It was never cold on the island, which was a relief. By the end of December, I had killed a goat for food. I also injured another one. Its leg was broken. I took the injured goat back to my shelter on a string and cared for it. After 2 weeks, the goat became less frightened, and this made me think about the possibility of keeping animals to provide a steady food source for myself. When the gunpowder supply began running low, I took the opportunity to explore the island further. I discovered more goats in the valleys at the center of the island. The animals were very shy, making it difficult to get close. However, I had an idea. I wanted to try and domesticate some of these goats. I just needed the right opportunity. The next day, I returned with my dog, who had become my loyal hunting partner. I instructed my dog to sit, wait, and not move while I circled around the goats from a distance. I positioned myself between the goats and my dog, hiding behind a tree. When the time was right, I shouted for my dog to come. The dog sprinted toward me, causing the goats to scatter, just as I had planned. This was only the beginning of my attempt to tame them, and I knew it would take time and patience. But I was determined. Chapter 11, The Earthquake and a New Hope. I stayed hidden behind the tree, waiting for one of the goats to come closer. As soon as a goat approached, I sprang out from behind the tree and grabbed its leg. I managed to hold on to it for a brief 2 seconds, but then the goat kicked me hard in the nose with its second leg. The pain was intense, and I quickly let go, watching as the goat ran off. It was clear that this wasn't the right method for catching a goat. I had to find a better way. I sighed and looked at my dog. "Let's go home. I need some rest," I said. The day had not gone as planned. Between January and March, I spent most of my time working on my fence. It was slow and exhausting, but I was determined to make it strong and thick enough to keep out any potential threats. While working, I also discovered pigeons on the island. They didn't nest in trees, but in small holes in the rocks. This made them easy to catch, and their meat was good. I also found that I could cook and eat their eggs. These pigeons became a regular part of my diet, along with the other food I was able to find on the island. One day, while cleaning and organizing my home, I found an old bag that used to contain corn. It was now filled with leaves and dust at the bottom. I emptied it out by my fence, knowing that I would need the bag for storing gunpowder later. It was just before the rainy season began. About a month later, I was amazed to find green leaves sprouting where I had discarded the old corn bag. Young corn had begun to grow just outside my fence. Words couldn't express the joy and excitement I felt. This small discovery brought new hope. Soon I would be able to bake bread. However, my excitement was short-lived. On the 16th of March, I was inside my cave when I suddenly noticed pieces of earth falling from the roof. Fear gripped me as I realized something was wrong. I ran outside, and it was then that I felt the ground beneath me tremble. The earth was shaking. It was an earthquake. My heart raced as I wondered whether my hard work would be destroyed in an instant. I sat frozen with fear, my heart pounding as the earth beneath me continued to shake. The ground seemed to rumble as large stones fell from the hill, crashing around me. I was lucky, the rocks didn't hit my tent, but I couldn't shake the dread that gripped me. The earthquake soon subsided, but I was too shaken to go back inside the cave. I stayed outside, sitting in front of my tent, feeling vulnerable and unsettled. The thought of going back into the cave terrified me. I started to think that it might be better to not sleep in the cave anymore. It didn't feel safe, especially if another earthquake were to strike. I didn't want to sleep in the tent either. I needed a new, safer place. So, I decided to build a proper house, a more secure shelter, and use the cave solely as a cellar. The next day, I set to work on my new home. It was April, and the task of building the house was immense, but I threw myself into it, determined to create a safe and stable place for myself. It took me 3 months of hard work, but by the end of July, I had a house that I could finally call home. I was proud of what I had accomplished, even though the island still felt so isolating at times. But then, as I was getting used to my new home, illness struck. In the last week of July, I began to feel unwell. A fever took over, and I could barely get out of bed. My body felt weak, and I was unable to do anything. My mind wandered as I lay there, feverish, and I began to have strange, almost surreal dreams. The dreams didn't make any sense, but to me, they felt so real, as if they were happening in the present. I could hardly tell what was real and what was a product of my illness. Chapter 12, A Strange Dream. One night, as I lay in bed, feverish and weak, I had a dream so vivid and strange that it stayed with me long after I woke. In this dream, I found myself in a pub on my island. A place that had no real existence but felt so familiar. I sat at a table, hoping to get a drink of rum. But the waitress, a woman whose face I couldn't quite place, was incredibly lazy. She sat at the bar doing nothing, her disinterest radiating from her. I felt frustrated, anger bubbling up inside me as I waited, but I didn't move. I simply sat there, simmering. Then, my wife appeared in the dream, walking into the pub. She handed me a piece of paper, a message from her father. It was brief but clear: "Come home, you should work on the plantations." But I didn't want to go back. I had made a life for myself here, on this island. I wanted to stay. As I sat there, my mind wandered to the kitchen of the pub, where I found my mother. She was cooking steaks and making soup. The smell of the food made me hungry, and when I tasted the soup, it was so delicious that it almost felt real. But the dream quickly shifted again, this time with the arrival of 2 Englishmen. They came to the bar, and they wanted to sell me gunpowder. One of them looked like a gentleman, but the other was unkempt and rough-looking. He approached me, and I politely told them I wasn't interested in their gunpowder. "I already have plenty," I said. "I have all I need in my camp." The gentleman nodded and backed off, but the other man, the one who looked horrible, grew angry. "What did you say?" he sneered. "Our gunpowder isn't good enough for you." He went on to tell me how they had traveled all the way from London to sell it to me. I tried to calm him, but it was no use. "Thank you, but I really don't need it," I said again. His anger flared. He said terrible things about me, and I fired back with my own insults. The conversation escalated quickly, and soon, the man pulled out a gun. He aimed it at me, and I knew the situation had become dangerous. In that moment, I bolted, running away from the pub as fast as I could. The man shot at me, but as the bullet whizzed past me, I woke up, my heart racing. The dream had felt so real, and yet, as I lay there in my bed, it was clear it had only been a product of my fevered mind. Chapter 13, A New Discovery and a Hard Decision. By the end of July, I finally felt better after the fever had left me. The weakness lingered for a while, but I knew that I needed to regain my strength. I focused on rest, allowing my body to heal, but also knowing that rest alone wouldn't restore me fully. In early August, I began to feel stronger, though I was still somewhat frail. I knew it was time for physical exercise. For the next 10 days, I walked around the island every day, pushing myself to explore more and become accustomed to the terrain again. Slowly but surely, I felt my body returning to its former strength. After these walks, I felt more energized, so I decided it was time to explore the entire island. The exploration began with a new valley I discovered, and within this valley, I found tobacco plants growing wild. It was a strange sight, something I hadn't expected to find on this island. Along with the tobacco, I discovered several other plants I had never seen before, their unfamiliar shapes and colors piquing my curiosity. The next day, I ventured further and stumbled upon a hidden treasure, a patch of melons and grapes. The discovery made me incredibly happy. I harvested what I could, drying the grapes into raisins. There were also apple, orange, and lemon trees, none of which I had noticed before. I gathered all the fruits, excited at the prospect of fresh food. I carefully piled all the fruit together, planning to return to my cave and fetch a bag to carry them back. But when I returned to the valley, I found a disappointing sight. The fruits I had gathered were destroyed. Some were eaten, while others were crushed, likely by wild animals. It was a frustrating blow, but it confirmed that I wasn't the only one on this island who depended on the land. Despite the setback, I continued to admire the valley, and it dawned on me that it might be a good place to move to. But then, I remembered the important detail that had kept me on the beach in the first place. From that valley, I wouldn't be able to see the ocean clearly, and I wouldn't be able to spot any ships passing by. The beach, despite its challenges, was still the best place for me to stay if I hoped to be rescued one day. Chapter 14, A New Home and a Time for Reflection. Rather than moving permanently to the Fruit Valley, I decided to build another house there. I would make it a place to visit from time to time, a retreat from my regular home. I set to work, constructing a small house and surrounding it with a double fence for protection. It was a fortress, as if I were building a castle to shield myself from the unknown. To enter and exit, I used a ladder on the outside and stairs on the inside of the fence, creating an interesting and practical combination of both. This task consumed most of August and the early part of September. But I enjoyed every moment of it. The Fruit Valley provided me with an abundance of energy, and I felt healthier and stronger than ever. The fruits, the fresh air, and the peacefulness of the valley became a source of rejuvenation for me. On quiet nights in the valley, I often found myself gazing up at the moon and the stars. I thought about my wife, my family back in England, and the life I once had. They too could see the same moon and stars that I saw, and yet we were separated by an ocean and an unbridgeable distance. I missed them dearly and wished the best for them. As I stared at the sky, I imagined the countless people across the world who were looking at the same moon, the same stars. I felt a connection to them, a shared human experience despite the isolation of my situation. In these moments, I also thought about God, wondering why I was on this island, why I had survived when my friends had perished. I had so many questions, but no answers came. Despite this, I trusted that God had a plan for me. I believed that He knew what He was doing, even if I couldn't see it clearly. By the time the rainy season arrived in mid-October, I had spent a full year on the island. The rains brought a change in the air, a reminder of the passage of time. As I looked back on my first year of survival, I couldn't help but reflect on how far I had come, the challenges I had faced, and the person I had become in the process. When I returned to my house in the valley, I was greeted with a pleasant surprise. The branches in the fence had all turned green, with new leaves growing over them. This was not only beautiful but also practical. The leaves covered my house entirely, making it nearly invisible from a distance. The natural canopy of leaves provided a cool, shaded refuge, making it a perfect retreat during the dry season. I loved it so much that I decided to replicate this by using the same type of branches to build a fence around my first house. With the end of the rainy season approaching, I felt it was the right time to plant my seeds. However, I proceeded cautiously, deciding to only use half of my seeds. This turned out to be a wise decision, as none of them sprouted. Disappointed but not discouraged, I saved the remaining seeds and waited for the next rainy season. When the rains returned, I planted the rest of my seeds, and this time, they grew successfully. It was the beginning of my small farm on the island. This experience also taught me an important lesson about the island's climate. There were 2 rainy seasons and 2 dry seasons each year. With this knowledge, I was now able to plan when to plant my crops and maximize my chances of success. The island was starting to feel more like home, with each passing day bringing me closer to self-sufficiency. Chapter 15, Discoveries and New Journeys. Soon, I realized that I needed baskets. With baskets, I could carry more food during my trips around the island, especially when gathering fruit from the fruit valley. I had already used branches from the same trees that I used for my fences to build the baskets. After drying the branches, I wove them into sturdy containers. Once I had made enough baskets, I decided to take another long trip around the island. After passing the fruit valley, I came across wide, flat grass fields. These fields were dotted with beautiful flowers that gave off a sweet fragrance. Insects were flying around, and I noticed some large butterflies with wings measuring about 10 centimeters across. The fields were surrounded by small trees bearing nuts. These nuts were different from those in England. They had a unique shape and were much sweeter. As I continued to explore, I discovered that this part of the island was teeming with life. There were parrots, rabbits, and even some cats. I managed to catch one of the parrots and decided to take it with me. The area also had many turtles and other birds, making it a more pleasant and abundant part of the island. Though I had found a wealth of food and new wonders, I decided not to stay and moved back toward my original home. On the way back, my dog captured a young kid, and I managed to save it, bringing it back with me. This trip had been full of discoveries, and I felt thankful for all the new experiences and resources the island was offering. I had always wanted to keep goats, and now I was presented with another chance. I left the kid in the valley house until I could prepare a proper space for it at my first home. I was exhausted from my journey, so I spent the entire day relaxing. During this time, I also made a cage for the parrot and brought the kid home, where it began to calm down. In the meantime, I decided to make a map of the island, marking all the newly discovered locations. As the days passed, time flew by, and before I knew it, it was September again, my second year on the island. I was no longer as sad or desperate as I had been when I first arrived. I had accepted my fate and was deeply grateful for my health and survival. I continued with my daily routine, hunting in the morning, cooking at lunchtime, relaxing during the afternoon when the sun was hottest, and working in the evening. I also taught the parrot to say its name, which I had decided to call Pole. By November and December, I had been busy with my fields. However, the wild goats and rabbits were eating the small plants, threatening to ruin all my hard work. To protect my crops, I quickly built a fence around the area where I had planted the seeds. I even put my dog inside the fence to guard the corn at night. The plants grew tall, but soon another threat emerged. Birds of all kinds began eating the seeds. I shot some of the birds and kept a close eye on my corn until the rest of them were gone, ensuring that my crops would survive and flourish. By the end of December, I had harvested my first corn. It wasn't much, but I decided not to eat it. My goal was to save it all for seeds so I could plant more corn in the future. As I looked ahead, I realized that in a year's time, I would need more tools. I began preparing for the future, starting with the tools I needed to store and preserve the corn. I searched the island for clay, which I found after some time. It took me 2 months of trial and error. But I eventually succeeded in making 2 large pots. To protect them from the elements, I placed them in baskets and stuffed dry grass between the baskets and the pots. With these pots completed, I began making smaller ones, along with plates and long, shallow pots. I also made a series of pots to hold sea water. Once the water evaporated, I was left with salt, which would be valuable in the future. One day, quite by accident, I discovered something interesting. A broken piece of one of my pots, which had been left in the fire, had become incredibly hard and red, like stone. This gave me an idea. I decided to heat one of my pots in the fire, and after a few hours, it was as hard as I had hoped. It was a valuable discovery, one that would help me make better tools in the future. The need for more tools continued to grow. I knew I needed a way to make flour from seeds, so I took a large piece of hard wood and carved a hole in it. Then, I took another hard piece of wood and used it to crush the seeds in the hole. The flour collected at the bottom of the hole, and I had my first success in grinding seeds into a usable form. Each of these small inventions brought me closer to creating a sustainable life on the island. As I settled into my 3rd year on the island, I realized that I needed something to bake bread. The idea came to me one day. I would mix the flour with water and use 2 stones to bake it. I heated the stones near the fire, and once they were very hot, I placed the dough between them. This was how I made my first bread on the island. It wasn't perfect, but it was a moment of triumph for me. It was my first bread in a long time, and despite its imperfections, I was proud of it. Inspired by this small success, I thought about the possibility of making a canoe. I found a large tree, one big enough to carve into a boat. I spent days cutting it and hollowing it out, but as I worked, I realized something. How would I move it from the forest to the beach? The idea had never crossed my mind. It took me many days to create the canoe, but the simple question of how to transport it had never occurred to me. In my desperation, I considered digging a channel from the beach to where the canoe rested. However, there was a hill in between, and digging through it would take far too long. Nothing seemed to work, and after exhausting all my efforts, I had to give up on the canoe. It was a painful lesson. All the work I had put into it was lost, and I felt foolish for not planning better. I vowed to be more thoughtful and strategic with my future endeavors. Chapter 16, New Beginnings. During my 4th year on the island, my clothes had worn out. I no longer had fabric to use, so I turned to the skins of the animals I hunted. I made myself a cap and other clothes entirely out of these skins. They kept me cool in the heat and provided protection from the heavy rain. Despite the clothes, I soon realized I also needed an umbrella for similar reasons. It took some time, but eventually, I succeeded in making one. It was a small victory, but it made life much easier. By then, I had everything I needed for survival on the island. My daily routine remained largely unchanged, but I was content. I continued to grow my corn, dried grapes to make raisins, and carried on with all the tasks I had grown accustomed to. My life had found a rhythm, and I felt at peace with it, but, like the restless spirit I was, I decided to make a new canoe. This time, I wanted one that was smaller and easier to move, one that would allow me to explore more of the island by water. When it was finished, I hoped to see more of the land that had become my home. On the 6th of June, during my 6th year on the island, I set out on a journey I had long planned. I packed food, water, and tools into my new canoe, ready to test if I could circle the entire island. The trip started out uneventfully, but soon, I faced the first challenge. As I navigated around some rocks in the sea, I realized the current was much stronger than I anticipated. It pulled me further away from the island. Fear gripped me as I realized I didn't have enough supplies for a long journey. I fought hard against the current, pushing with every ounce of strength I had. After 2 long hours of struggle, I finally managed to steer the canoe closer to the shore. I felt triumphant, knowing that I had outlasted the powerful currents that surrounded the island. It gave me a boost of confidence, and soon I discovered a small river winding its way further inland. Eager to explore, I followed it, but I soon encountered an obstacle, narrowing waters and stones that blocked my path. I had no choice but to leave the canoe behind and continue on foot. As I explored, I found myself near the valley where my second home stood. Exhausted from the journey, I rested, only to be startled awake by a voice calling my name. "Robinson, where are you? Robinson, where are you?" At first, I was terrified, thinking I was hearing things, but then I looked up and saw my parrot, Pole, perched on top of a hedge. He had picked up the phrases I had repeated so often, mimicking my voice with the same intonation. I couldn't believe my ears. I had left the parrot back at my house, but here he was, speaking to me. Though it was a strange moment, it made me feel less lonely. I left my canoe behind and returned home with Pole. For the next year, I stayed mostly at my house, focusing on my usual tasks. I spent my time crafting wooden tools, making clay pots, and even developing a way to create them with a wheel, and enjoying the comfort of my routine. I even managed to make a tobacco pipe, something I had missed deeply since arriving on the island. Life had settled into a pattern, and I had learned to adapt. Chapter 17, A New Way of Living. As the years passed on the island, I faced another challenge. My gunpowder supply was running low, and I feared I wouldn't be able to hunt any more goats once it was gone. The kid I had once caught had grown old, and it was too late to find a male to mate with her. I wanted meat, but I couldn't bring myself to kill her. Eventually, she passed away peacefully, and I realized it had been 11 years since my arrival. For all this time, I had relied on gunpowder to provide for myself, but now I needed to find a new source of food. I decided to experiment with traps. At first, my attempts were unsuccessful, but after a while, I managed to catch 3 young goats, 1 male and 2 females. I brought them home and immediately started to build a fence to keep them safe from the wild ones. The fence took me 3 months to complete, but once it was done, I created a space with plenty of grass and water for the goats to thrive. As the months passed, the goats grew calmer, and I was able to feed them by hand. Over time, they became a reliable source of milk and meat. In just 2 years, I had a dozen goats, and within 3 years, my herd had grown to more than 20. This abundance of goats allowed me to experiment with making cheese and butter. And my table was now full. Alongside my goats, I still had my loyal dog, several cats, and of course, Pole, my parrot. Yet, despite the full life I had created, the one thing I still longed for was someone to talk to. The solitude of the island had become a constant companion, and though I had everything I needed, the silence weighed heavily on my heart. One day, I set out to explore the part of the island where I had encountered the strong current. As I walked, I couldn't help but reflect on how ridiculous I must have looked. If any Englishmen had seen me, they would have surely laughed. I wore a large hat, a short jacket, and short trousers, all made from goat skin. I had no socks or shoes. But I wrapped goat skin around my feet. 2 belts hung from my waist, one for my gun and knife, the other for the gunpowder. On my back, I carried a basket and a gun rested on my shoulder. Above me, I held an umbrella made of goat skin to protect from the sun. My beard had grown quite long over the years. I realized how much I had changed from the man I once was, back in England. I was no longer a man of civilization, but rather a creature of the island. It was around lunchtime when I was walking along the beach, heading toward my canoe, when I came across something that made my heart race. In the sand, I saw the unmistakable mark of a human footprint. I looked around quickly, but there was no sign of anyone nearby. Fear gripped me, and I hurried back to my home. That night, I was too scared to sleep. Why had there been no other signs, no canoe, no more footprints? Could someone else have seen my canoe and was now preparing to attack me? I tried to calm myself, thinking that perhaps I had simply seen the mark of my own foot, but my imagination had run wild. I was scared for no reason. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I convinced myself I was being foolish, and with newfound courage, I decided to return to the beach and examine the footprint once more. Chapter 18, Fear and Precaution. When I approached the footprint, my fear intensified. It was much larger than my own foot. There was no way it could have been mine. Panic surged through me again, and the thought of cannibals or hostile strangers lurking nearby made my stomach churn. I spent the entire night tossing and turning, terrified. My mind raced with possibilities. Should I let all my animals go free and destroy my fields and summer house? I thought of erasing every sign of human habitation from the island, so no trace of me remained. The fear of being found by strangers was overwhelming. I spent the whole night awake, gripped by anxiety. When I finally managed to sleep, it was only for a short time. But when I woke up, my head felt clearer. I realized it wasn't so strange that people could live on the islands around me. Perhaps they came to my island from time to time, or maybe the wind had carried them here. For the first time in 15 years on the island, had not encountered a single human or discovered any signs of a settlement. This thought calmed me down somewhat. Still, I didn't want to take any chances. To be safe, I decided to fortify my home even more. I built another wall around my house, with small holes through which I could fire multiple guns in case of an attack. My house was now a fortress, surrounded by thick trees and walls strong enough to keep anyone at bay, but my goats remained a concern. I knew I had to protect them as well. I divided the animals and created a smaller fence on a different part of the island. It took a lot of time and effort, but in the end, my animals were safe from any unexpected threat. Chapter 19, Grief and Fear. The 16th year of my life on the island was marked by a sorrowful event. My dog passed away. For 3 days, I couldn't stop crying. It was the hardest and most painful time I had experienced on the island. My faithful companion, who had been with me for so long, was gone. I went to visit my goats and spoke to them about my sadness. They didn't understand my words, of course, but I could feel that they understood my emotions. They remained unusually calm and quiet, as if they sensed my grief. It was 2 years since I had found the mysterious footprint on the beach. One day, while walking toward the shore, I thought I saw a canoe in the distance. But I couldn't be sure, so I continued my walk. Then, I came across something that froze my blood. The entire beach was covered with human remains, skulls, hands, and feet scattered everywhere, and there was a blackened circle from a fire. The horrifying sight sent a wave of anger and fear through me. They were here again, the cannibals. I felt sick to my stomach and threw up. I quickly left the beach and returned to my house, my mind racing with what to do next. I knew I had to stop going out to sea with my canoe, as the cannibals could capture me. I also stopped firing my guns, afraid the sounds would draw attention. Whenever I left the house, I carried weapons with me, preparing for a possible attack. The fear gnawed at me. I began to think about how I could defend myself, maybe even kill some of the cannibals to protect myself and others if they had victims. I considered how I could frighten them so they would never return to my island. I started to scout the area where I had first found the footprint, looking for a suitable hiding place in case of an attack, but then, after much thought, I changed my mind. It seemed unreasonable to fight them. After all, they hadn't caused me harm directly. Maybe I was overreacting. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I had no real reason to attack them first. Chapter 20, Hiding and Hope. I eventually abandoned all my preparations for dealing with the cannibals, deciding that I would only act if they attacked me first. For the next year, I took every precaution to hide my activities. I kept my canoe hidden, stayed focused on caring for my animals and tending to my fields, all the while being as discreet as possible. I feared loud noises, and every time I made a fire, I worried that the smoke might rise too high and be seen from a distance. The smoke was a risk, but I needed fire to cook. To minimize the danger, I kept the smoke to a minimum. One day, while cutting branches in the forest, I stumbled upon a small cave. Curiosity drew me inside, but as my eyes adjusted to the dark, I saw 2 bright eyes staring back at me. My heart leaped into my throat, and I jumped back, terrified. I waited for a while, but nothing happened. Slowly, I approached the cave's entrance and listened carefully. I could hear faint sounds, almost like someone or something was injured inside. I grabbed my gun and entered cautiously. As my eyes adjusted once again, I saw that the source of the noise was an old goat, lying in the cave, dying. I felt a pang of sympathy, but there was nothing I could do for it. The next day, I returned to the cave, only to find that the goat had passed away. As I explored further, I realized that the cave was very safe and would make an excellent hiding place, especially close to the beach. So, I brought some of my guns and gunpowder to store there, just in case. 23 years had passed since I first set foot on the island. I had grown accustomed to my life here. I lived comfortably, surrounded by animals that kept me company. Pole, my faithful parrot, would repeat my name in a pleasant voice. I had even acquired 2 more parrots, and I spent time teaching them all to pronounce my name, creating a strange but welcome sense of connection on this otherwise lonely island. It was the last month of my 23rd year on the island when, early one morning as I was walking to my fields, I saw fire on the beach. I immediately returned to my house, loaded all the guns, grabbed my telescope, and made my way closer to the shore. Hiding myself, I observed 9 naked people arriving in 2 canoes. They seemed to be waiting for the high tide to leave the island. As soon as they left, I went to the beach. It was covered in blood and bones, a sight that made me feel both sick and angry. I vowed to kill as many of them as I could the next time I saw them, but they didn't return for a long time. In the meantime, something else disturbed my routine. One evening, I was jolted from my usual activities by the sound of a gunshot from the sea. I rushed outside and saw a flash coming from the water, followed by another shot. I assumed it was from a ship in distress, signaling for help. I gathered all the dry wood I could find, ran to the beach, and built a large fire. They must have seen it because they fired again. I thought to myself, I will speak to someone tonight. This is it. I kept the fire burning until midnight, but no one came. There was no sign of them. It was strange. My mind couldn't make sense of it. Maybe I would learn more in the morning, I thought. This revision maintains the original's tone and details while enhancing clarity and flow. Let me know if you'd like any further changes. Chapter 21, Visitors. The next morning, I saw the ship. It had stopped far from the beach, and it appeared empty. I didn't understand it. I had expected the people who had fired the gun yesterday. I was desperate to communicate with someone. I missed interacting with real people terribly. I took my canoe and decided to go to the ship to see if anyone was still alive on board. The ship looked Spanish and was completely destroyed. As I got closer, I noticed a dog on board. He was overjoyed to see me, and I gave him some bread and water. He was both hungry and incredibly thirsty. I found no one else on the ship. Where had the men gone? I couldn't make sense of it. It was a mystery. There were many boxes with various items on the ship, some small, some large. Many of the large boxes contained bottles of alcohol, but they were too heavy to take on the canoe. I also found guns and gunpowder, which I took back with me. There were other useful things as well. By evening, I returned to the island with several small boxes in my canoe. Among them were new shirts, gold, silver, and a considerable amount of gunpowder. The gunpowder was especially valuable to me on the island. It was more valuable to me than any money or precious metals. There was something else I needed badly: shoes. On board the ship, I found 2 pairs, and I took them with me. I placed all my new items in the cave. I made 5 trips to the ship, bringing back everything that could be useful. Afterward, I hid the canoe again and returned to my house. Life returned to its usual rhythm, and time seemed to fly by. Still, I often thought about the men from the ship and the cannibals on the beach. These thoughts lingered in the back of my mind, day and night. One night in March, I had a vivid dream. In it, 2 canoes full of cannibals landed on the beach. One of their victims escaped and came to my house, where I saved him. We became friends, and he helped me navigate the dangerous currents around the island. I woke up, but the dream stayed with me. It made me realize that if I had someone to help me, I might be able to escape the island and reach the mainland. Perhaps I could even save one of the victims brought to the island. Determined, I decided to keep an eye out for the cannibals. Over the next year and a half, I patrolled the beach daily, hoping to spot canoes. Finally, it happened. One morning, I saw 5 canoes with more than 30 men on the beach. I knew I couldn't attack, they were too many. So, I waited and observed them through my telescope. They built a fire and began dancing around it. I also saw 2 men, victims who were tied together. The 2 tied men were dragged to the fire. After a while, one of them was beaten and killed. The cannibals painted their bodies with his blood. It felt like a theater performance, but this wasn't a performance, it was real. It was horrible, but I couldn't do anything, there were too many cannibals. The second man waited on the side. When the cannibals weren't looking, he suddenly jumped up and started to run. He was heading in my direction. I quickly ran to the beach and hid behind a tree. I saw that only 2 cannibals were chasing him. This was my chance to save the prisoner. The man ran as fast as he could, but the cannibals were gaining on him. Their speed was faster than his, and they were getting closer and closer. Chapter 22, Friday, I prepared 2 guns and waited behind the tree. The prisoner ran directly toward me, but he still didn't see me. I stayed perfectly still. He ran around me, and I remained hidden behind the tree. When the first cannibal ran close to me, I leapt from behind the tree. He was caught off guard. I shot him. The second cannibal saw this and tried to shoot an arrow at me. I had no choice but to shoot him as well. The prisoner stopped when he heard the shots and turned. He looked scared, but I smiled at him and motioned for him to come closer. He cautiously approached, knelt down, and placed his head on the ground. Then, he took my foot and put it on his head in a gesture of respect. I gestured for him to stand up, and he did, gazing at the 2 dead cannibals. He approached their bodies and examined the wounds. He probably couldn't understand what had happened, it was unbelievable to him. He took the arrows from the dead men. Together, we hid their bodies in the forest. Then, we ventured deeper into the woods. I led him to my cave, my secret place where no one could find us. I gave him bread, meat, and water. He was so exhausted that he fell asleep almost immediately. I had a chance to really look at him. He was young, slim, but very strong. I estimated he was about 25 years old. He had long black hair, dark skin, and a pleasant face. I let him sleep and went outside, staying near the cave to watch for the cannibals, but they didn't seem to be searching for us. 3 hours later, the man came out of the cave, clearly overjoyed that he was alive and safe. I started speaking to him and decided to name him Friday, since it was the day I saved his life. I told him my name and taught him the words, yes, and no. We stayed in the cave that night. The next day, we went to the top of the hill. Through my telescope, I saw that the canoes were gone. We were alone on the island. We cautiously made our way to the beach. First, we went to the spot where we had hidden the bodies of the dead cannibals. When we found them, Friday wanted to eat them. I was furious and showed him that it was wrong to do so. In that moment, I realized that Friday, too, was a cannibal. We buried the bodies of the cannibals, then walked further along the beach. What we saw was horrifying, human bones scattered all around, and the sand stained red with blood. I asked Friday to collect all the body parts, and I prepared a large fire. I decided to burn the remains. Then, we headed back to my house. I set up a small tent for Friday between the two fences around my house and took away all his weapons. I wanted to feel safe. But after a while, I realized this wasn't necessary at all, because Friday was a very faithful and honest man. He was like a child to me, and I was like a father to him. On many occasions, he showed me that he would sacrifice his life to save mine. I was very happy to have Friday with me, and I began teaching him everything he needed to know about life, like a European. I started with some basic words: hi, hello, bye. Thank you. At first, it wasn't easy, but I was patient because I was overjoyed to finally be able to speak to someone. Chapter 23, Conversation. 2 days later, I shot a young goat. Friday was scared of the gun. He couldn't understand how such a small thing could kill a goat. He didn't want to touch the gun. Later, I saw him talking to it, probably asking the gun not to kill him. We took the goat and made a delicious soup. Before the soup was finished, Friday went to the forest and brought back some herbs. He added them to the soup, and they resembled pepper. The soup smelled fantastic, and it tasted just as amazing. We cooked some of the goat meat the next day, and Friday brought more herbs and plants. The herbs made the sauce taste incredible, and they made a big difference. We also made a nice salad from the plants. I taught Friday how to prepare corn and bake bread from it, and in a few days, he could do it as well as I could. Then, we started expanding my garden, and he helped me plant more corn. In all activities, Friday was a great help. He was also very skilled at catching fish. Our cooperation was simply wonderful. We made a great team. I wanted to teach Friday to speak English very well, and I aimed to teach him as quickly as possible. I took my role as his teacher very seriously. I thought about the best method to teach Friday English. When I spoke quickly and used all the grammar and words I knew, he didn't understand me. So, I decided to speak mainly in the present tense and use simple words, sticking to short sentences. This way, Friday understood much more. We talked about many topics, and whenever he didn't understand something, I pointed to it or tried to explain the word. If that didn't help, I drew a picture of the thing in the sand. Soon, Friday began to understand many of my sentences in the present tense, and he started using some words himself. His pronunciation was very poor at first, but that didn't matter to me. I understood him. And I was simply happy that someone was speaking to me. Friday was a good student. He was clever and improved quickly. Soon, he could say some words almost like a native English speaker. Not all the words, of course, but the ones he said correctly made me very happy. I noticed that Friday often repeated aloud what I said, and I thought that helped him learn faster. I realized that learning a language is quite simple. You just need to copy what you hear, and if you don't understand something, you need to make a picture of it. Then, with lots of practice, you'll improve. This, I believed, was the best system. Friday's progress was fast. Every day, he could talk more and more, and in a couple of months, we could have basic, simple conversations. Friday was fascinated by my tools, especially the telescope. He borrowed it often and would climb one of the hills to watch everything around. One day, I asked him about his people and how he became a prisoner. He told me that they ate human meat, just like their enemies. In fact, in the past, he had performed a ritual on the other side of my island. He was probably one of the cannibals I had seen a long time ago. He also told me about the sea and its currents. Thanks to Friday, I learned a lot about the history, culture, and traditions of his people. I also shared my personal story with him and described England and Europe. Chapter 24, The Knife. I told Friday about the schools in our city, ships, and traveling around the world. I explained that education is very important in Europe, and we study from books. This was all new to Friday. His people didn't need schools on their islands because they had everything they needed for their lives. Once I felt I could trust him, I showed Friday how gunpowder worked. I taught him how to use a gun and gave him a knife and a belt. He was so happy to have these things. He said he had seen a similar knife before. I asked him to tell me more about it. He explained that his people had saved white men from a small boat, and those men still lived with them. He counted 17 Europeans who lived with his people. I thought these might be the sailors from the ship that came to my island a while ago. They probably escaped in a boat after the ship sank. When I went on board to look for survivors, I didn't find anyone. I asked Friday to tell me more about them. He said that the Europeans were okay, and that made me feel happy. It was good to know that some Europeans were not far from my island. I started to plan how I could meet them. The next day, Friday, and I went on a small trip around the island. First, we went to the cross, where I wanted to mark another day. "What is it?" asked Friday when we reached the cross. I explained that we have 7 days in a week. When Friday heard the word Friday, he laughed. I told him that I saved him on a Friday, which is why I called him Friday. Now, he understood the meaning of his name. During our walk, Friday said, "If we build a canoe and go to my island, I will tell my people how you saved my life." I took Friday to the other side of the island and showed him my canoe. But he said, "This canoe is too small for 2 people. We should make a bigger one." So, we started building the canoe we needed. We found a big tree, cut it down, and I showed him how to carve out the inside to shape the canoe. It took us a month to finish, and 2 more days to drag it to the beach. Finally, the canoe was ready, and so were we. The day before we planned to leave, Friday went to the beach. He came back quickly, looking very scared. Before I could ask him what happened, he said, "There are 3 canoes on the beach." He was scared because he thought the cannibals had returned to look for him. He said there was a war between 2 groups of local people. "We are neighbors, but we don't like each other," he explained. "We've had many conflicts in the past. There has never been peace. We kill each other whenever we can. If they see me, they will kill me." I told him not to worry. "We are strong, and maybe they didn't come for you. We'll see." We took 15 guns and went to the top of a hill. From there, we saw 14 cannibals, 2 prisoners, and 3 canoes on the beach. The cannibals had stopped close to where the forest met the beach, which made it easier for us to attack them and save the prisoners. We quietly approached them through the forest. As we walked, I thought about whether I had the right to kill them. Maybe I had no reason to shoot so many people who hadn't done anything wrong to me. After thinking for a while, I decided to just watch and only attack if it became necessary. Chapter 25, Father. When we were very close to the beach, we saw the cannibals gathered around the fire. They had started eating the first of their prisoners. The second prisoner was still alive. He wasn't one of Friday's people, he was European. The cannibals wanted to eat him too. I decided to save him if I could. we moved closer to where the cannibals were. They were still around the fire, but two of them went toward the white man. When I saw this, I loaded the guns and told Friday to do exactly what I did. We quickly fired 6 shots at the cannibals, killing 3 and injuring 2. The rest of the cannibals jumped to their feet, confused about which way to run, not knowing where the danger was coming from. Some ran toward their canoes, and others stayed on the beach. We continued shooting and killed 3 more cannibals. After that, we grabbed our guns and ran to the beach. We shouted loudly to scare them. I ran to the European prisoner, and Friday shot the nearest cannibal. I freed the European, and he said something to me in Spanish. I gave him a gun. He was weak but could still shoot if a cannibal attacked him. The cannibals were shocked by our sudden attack. Our unusual guns scared the cannibals a lot. Only 2 of them tried to fight us, and we shot them with our guns. Friday fought very well. He quickly killed one of the cannibals who was injured. The second injured cannibal ran into the forest, and Friday chased him down. He killed him with his knife. Only 3 cannibals were able to escape. They jumped into their canoe and started to leave. Friday shot at them, but he didn't hit them. It was dangerous to let them go because they could tell their people about us. Friday and I wanted to jump into one of their canoes to chase them, but to our surprise, we found another tied-up person at the bottom of the canoe. He was scared because he hadn't seen the fight, only heard it. The ropes were so tight around his neck that he would have died soon if I hadn't cut them. When Friday saw him, he started crying, then laughed, and hugged the man. He jumped up and began dancing around him, crying and laughing at the same time. When the strongest emotions passed, Friday told me that the prisoner was his father. I felt tears in my eyes when I saw the love between father and son. This happy moment delayed us, and by the time we were ready, the cannibals had already gone. Friday returned to the canoe and held his father's head to his chest. He rubbed his father's hands and feet to warm him up. Soon, Friday's father felt much better. When they spoke, Friday suddenly jumped up and ran into the forest as fast as he could. When he came back, he had a bottle full of fresh water. He gave the bottle to his father, who was dying of thirst. After drinking, his father felt much better. I asked Friday to give the rest of the water to the Spanish man, who needed it very badly too. The Spanish man was very grateful, but he was so weak that he couldn't get up on his feet. I asked Friday to rub his hands and feet, just as he had done for his father. This helped him a lot. Then, I asked the Spanish man to go to the canoe with Friday's help because I wanted to take them to our place. However, being young and strong, Friday just picked up the Spanish man, put him on his back, and carried him to the canoe. Then, he carefully placed him there and made sure both he and his father were comfortable. Chapter 26, Dinner. When the Spanish man was inside the canoe, Friday jumped out and guided it along the beach faster than I could walk. We soon reached the place where I had saved Friday. Friday helped our new guests out of the canoe, but they were still too weak to walk. We had to carry them to our home. We faced another problem when we reached the house. Friday's father and the Spanish man couldn't get over the fence or climb the ladder, and I didn't want to destroy the fence. I considered pulling them over, but then I realized the cannibals were already gone. We decided to stay outside the fence. We made a comfortable tent for them and prepared soft beds as well. As soon as we finished, I started cooking dinner. Friday brought some fish, and we cooked it quickly. We all ate dinner together in the tent. Friday acted as my interpreter because the Spanish man spoke the language of Friday's people. After dinner, I asked Friday to go back to the beach and bring us the weapons we had left in our hurry. I also asked him to bury the bodies of the killed cannibals. The next day, he did as I asked. Later, when I went to the beach, I could hardly recognize the place. If it wasn't for the big tree behind which we were hidden, I wouldn't have known where we had been. The next morning, I asked Friday's father what he thought of the cannibals returning to kill us. He said our guns had created a great shock. The cannibals didn't know how we won the battle using them. He told me he had heard them shout in their language that Friday and I were spirits sent from heaven to punish them with fire. I was still worried the cannibals might return with a bigger army, but nothing of the sort happened. When our guests were strong enough, I started thinking about the journey by sea again. I asked the Spanish man about his arrival on these islands, and he told me that he was on a Spanish ship heading to Havana. There were 16 Europeans, both Spanish and Portuguese, on Friday's home island. He explained that a storm had broken the ship near my island, and they had saved themselves in a boat. Now, they lived with Friday's people. I asked the Spanish man if they had tried to make another sea journey. Of course, they wanted to go home, but he said they had no tools to build another ship. I showed him the tools I had taken from the ship, and he said that with these tools, it was possible to build a ship. I thought that maybe the Spanish and Friday's father could return to their island. They could tell the other Europeans about the possibility of building a ship. Together, we could sail to Brazil, Havana, or maybe even Europe. However, the Spanish man suggested something else. He told me that it would be better to wait for at least half a year because there wasn't enough food for 16 more men on my island. We wouldn't have enough food to eat while building the ship. And even less to take with us on the long journey. The Spanish man advised me to plant more corn, and he and Friday's father helped us expand the fences and fields. We also caught more goats, increasing the number to 50 animals. We collected a lot of fruit and then dried it. We started preparing the materials for the ship. We chose a few trees, and I showed them how to cut them into long boards. After half a year, we had gathered plenty of food. We had so much corn that we realized we needed more baskets and pots to store it all. We noticed that the Spanish man was very good at making baskets. He had a great talent for it, and his baskets were excellent. He also used a special technique that made the process fast and effective. He could make baskets 3 times faster than me. I asked him to teach me his skill. I wasn't as fast as him, but I was much faster than before. Chapter 27, Englishman. We put all the food in my cave, where it was safe. Then, the Spanish man and Friday's father could go back to their island to bring the other men here. We gave them food and 4 guns in case they were attacked again. They took the canoe and left. 2 days passed since they left when something unexpected happened. I was woken up by Friday at about 6 o'clock in the morning. "Are they here?" I asked Friday. He replied, "Not yet, but somebody else is here. I saw a boat." I went to the top of the nearest hill and saw the boat. It was clear that these people weren't the friends we expected. The boat came from a completely different direction. I could also see a ship in the distance. I recognized its shape. The ship was English. I was confused. On one hand, I was happy to see Englishmen after 27 years on the island. On the other hand, I was concerned because the island was quite out of the way for any English ship. There hadn't been any storms recently that could have taken them here. Perhaps they were pirates or murderers hiding on the island. All this made me very cautious. Friday and I remained hidden, observing them for a while. The boat approached the beach, and I counted 11 men. They were all Englishmen. 3 of the men had their hands tied together. The 8 other men took them to the beach. 2 prisoners were calm, but the third looked very scared and tried to say something. He asked the men in the boat for something. Upon seeing this, Friday turned to me and said that it seemed the Englishmen were also eating people. I told him that they had no intention of eating them. Instead, I thought they were going to shoot them. After a while, I noticed this wasn't the case. The people from the boat went exploring the island, while the 3 tied prisoners sat on the beach with 2 men as guards. The prisoners looked desperate. The situation reminded me of my own arrival on the island. Like those prisoners, I had felt lost at first. Soon, the tide went low, and the boat they came in got stuck in the sand. They couldn't move it, so I heard them shout to each other that they would leave with the next tide. This gave me about 10 hours. Night was approaching, so we would have an opportunity to get closer to them and overhear their conversations. Now, I was sure they had come here to leave those 3 men as punishment. Friday and I stayed hidden until dark. I noticed that the guards were asleep, and the 3 prisoners were sitting under a tree quite close to us. They seemed to be out of sight from the other sailors, so I decided I could approach them without being seen. I went toward them with Friday closely following behind me. When we were very close, I spoke quietly to them, still hidden behind the trees. They couldn't see us. When they heard my voice, they couldn't believe someone was speaking English to them from the dark forest. What was that? Asked one of the men. I heard something, said another. I heard a tree speak. But that's impossible, the first man said. A tree can't speak English. Yes, you heard something, I said quietly, but it isn't a tree. My name is Robinson Crusoe. I am an Englishman. I live on this island. I will help you if you tell me who you are. After the initial shock wore off, one of them answered my questions. He was the captain of the ship, but some of the sailors had started a mutiny. He, his assistant, and a passenger were taken prisoner. The other sailors planned to leave them on the island to starve to death. The captain told me that there were only 2 dangerous sailors who had taken control of the others in this group. If the leaders were captured, the rest would return under the captain's command. Chapter 28, Control. I told the captain, I'm willing to help you, but I have one condition. I want full control over the ship if we manage to get it back. The captain and the other 2 prisoners agreed, and they gave me full control over the ship and their lives. We freed the prisoners and went back to the forest. I gave them guns, and we started to plan the attack. In the middle of our conversation, we noticed the sailors who were standing guard had woken up. They stood up and shouted to 3 other men nearby. At that moment, we shot the guards. Then, the captain spoke to the 3 other men. He told them to be loyal to him and help him get back to the ship. They agreed, so we tied them up and left them on the beach. The other 3 men, who had heard the shots, came back. They could see the situation had changed. We were 5 with many guns. It was a bad situation for them, so they also agreed to be loyal to the captain. We tied these men up as well. We hid our 6 prisoners in the forest, and then the captain and I finally had time to talk to each other. I told him my story, and he was shocked. He thanked me a lot for my help. He and his 2 friends were hungry, so we went to my house where I showed them what I had built for myself during my stay on the island. They were amazed by everything I had made. However, we didn't have much time to explore my inventions because we had to plan how to get the ship back. There were 16 people on board, and we were only 5. First, we decided to take everything out of the boat. We thought the sailors might send another boat to the island if the men from the first boat didn't return with the next high tide. In the morning, we heard the ship fire a gun as a signal for the boat to return. After a while, the ship fired a few more times, but there was still no response. Then we noticed that the sailors had taken another boat and were heading to the beach. Through my telescope, I could see 8 men rowing, and they were all armed. We watched the boat approach, and the captain recognized the sailors. He knew that 6 of them were still loyal to him, but there was also the man who had started the mutiny. The captain feared that the leader of the mutiny and the other men in the boat would be difficult to defeat, but I told him that we had a good chance of winning if we acted quickly. The captain trusted 2 of our prisoners, and they promised to fight on our side. We gave them weapons. With 7 men ready to fight on our side, we prepared for the boat's arrival. As soon as it reached the beach, we would act. The men jumped out of the boat and pulled it up the beach. Then they ran to the other boat and were surprised to find it empty. They tried calling their friends, shouting their names, and shooting into the air, but it was all useless because no one shouted back. This confused the newly arrived sailors even more, and they began putting the boat back in the water. It seemed they wanted to go back to the ship to inform the others that something had happened to the sailors in the first boat. As we observed all this, the captain got scared. He worried that they would return to the ship and leave the island altogether. Luckily, after a few seconds, the sailors dropped this idea. They left 3 men in the boat, and the others went into the forest to search for their friends. Chapter 29, Plan. We continued to observe the actions of the 2 groups. The 5 men in the forest sat down under a tree and discussed for a long time. After their consultation, they got up and started walking toward the beach. They had probably given up on looking for their friend, and we knew we had to act quickly before they reached their boat. I had a plan. I told the captain's assistant to go with Friday deeper into the island and shout at the sailors. When the sailors heard this, they shouted back, and then they started heading toward the voice. Friday and the assistant continued shouting, leading the sailors to the opposite side of the island. This strategy worked just as I had planned. The 5 men were soon very far from the beach, which was great for us. We went to the 3 men in the boat and explained the situation. They decided not to fight us and became our prisoners too. Meanwhile, Friday and the captain's assistant returned. They had led the other sailors so far away that they wouldn't be back for at least 2 hours. We hid and waited for them. When the sailors returned, they were very tired. They were surprised to find the boat empty. They started calling for their friends, but again, there was no response. After a while, the leader of the mutiny and 2 others separated from the rest and walked toward the forest where we were hiding. As soon as they got closer, the captain and Friday attacked them, catching them away from the group. The leader was killed on the spot, the second man was injured, and the third ran back. We all emerged from the forest and ran to the boat. The captain spoke to the sailors and asked them to surrender. When they understood the situation, they dropped their weapons quickly. We decided to tie up the prisoners, but we didn't tie all of them. The captain trusted 3 of the men, so we left them untied. Now, we had 10 men. We began to plan how to take the ship. After some discussion, we knew what needed to be done. Friday and I stayed on the island to watch the prisoners, while the captain, his assistant, and the passenger disguised themselves in the clothes of some of the prisoners. The captain and his sailors then took the boat and went toward the ship. When they were near, they spoke to the men aboard the ship, telling them it was impossible to find the other men. Once all the men from the boat were on the ship, the captain revealed himself, and the attack began. Several sailors were injured during the battle, and only one person was shot, the second leader of the mutiny. As soon as the captain regained control of the ship, he ordered 7 gunshots to be fired, the signal we had agreed on. I was thrilled to hear the shots. Soon, the captain returned to the island, and we hugged each other. He told me that the ship was now under my control. I was so happy that I cried so much I couldn't speak. After calming down a little, I was finally able to talk. The captain ordered his men to bring a lot of food from the ship to the island, as we were going to have a nice meal to celebrate our victory and my departure from the island. There was expensive wine, excellent tobacco, pork, beef, peas, and biscuits for dessert. I was very happy to taste all those things again. The captain also gave me clean clothes, something I hadn't worn for a long time. The clothes were light and a little uncomfortable at first, but soon, they felt fine. When the meal was over and I had clean clothes again, the captain and I needed to discuss what to do with the 5 prisoners whom the captain didn't trust. The men were truly horrible, and the captain even feared taking them aboard the ship in chains. I suggested we talk to them and see if they might choose to stay on the island instead of facing death in England for mutiny. We met with the prisoners and explained the situation. They had to choose between a death sentence in England or a life on the island, and they opted for the second choice. We placed them in the cave, which had now become the prison, and I told them to wait for further orders. Chapter 30. Son, I needed some time to prepare for the journey. I had to think about what to take with me. In fact, I didn't need to take many things. I decided to bring my dog, my parrot, my book, and a few other small items. I also took the money, gold and silver, that I had found on the ship. They were finally useful to me. I met with the prisoners one more time, showing them my corn, my domestic animals, and telling them about what I had discovered and built on the island. Then, I went on board the ship. We left the island on the 19th of December, 1686. It had been 27 years, 2 months, and 19 days since I first set foot on the island. First, we went to the island where Friday's people lived. The Spanish and Portuguese sailors were very happy when they saw us, especially since we now had a ship. We didn't need to build a new one, we could go to Europe. My dog was very happy, too. When he saw one of the Spanish sailors, he ran to him quickly and jumped on him. He was extremely happy to see his owner. The Spanish sailor was equally joyful and began to cry when he saw his dog. It was a very emotional reunion. The sailors began to prepare for our journey across the ocean. Friday had to make a decision: he could stay with his people or go to Europe with me. He needed some time to think about it. We stayed on the island for one more night. In the morning, I asked Friday if he had made his decision. He told me that he wanted to go with me to Europe. He prepared everything for the journey, and we were ready to go. We started our journey, and 2 months later, after a safe voyage across the ocean, I stepped on English soil again. 35 years had passed since I left my homeland. It seemed to me that the whole world had changed in that time. London was a completely different city. There were new houses, streets, roads, shops, parks, and a big bridge across the river. But it wasn't just the city, people had changed, too. They wore different clothes, women had different hairstyles, men wore different hats, and there were new types of guns. People used tools I had never seen before, and they had new names for these tools. It was all very interesting. Even the style of music in the pubs was different. I heard new songs, and I liked this new style. I wanted to sing these new songs. After my time in London, I returned to my town, York. My parents had both passed away, but I found some relatives. My sister, my uncle, and my aunt were still alive. They were happy to see me, but they had thought I was long dead, so I had no rights to the family's money or land. However, I was allowed to stay and live in their house. England was a big shock to Friday. Everything was so new for him. He saw so many things for the first time in his life. It was all very interesting to him. What he didn't like, however, was the cold weather in winter. February brought snow, ice, and freezing temperatures, which weren't good for him. It didn't make sense to him why we lived in such conditions. I told him that the weather was much better in the summer. I sent a letter to Brazil. I still knew the address very well and wanted to contact the people there. I wanted to know if my wife was still alive, and I wanted to know if my plantation still existed, but I didn't know what to expect. The connection had been broken many years ago. In May, I received a letter and some packages from my wife. She wrote that she had waited for me for 10 years, but eventually stopped believing I was alive. She married again and had a family, but her new husband had died 2 years ago. I also received a letter from my wife's father. He had taken care of my plantation, and in his letter, he included detailed calculations of the expenses and profits from the plantation over the years. They both sent me many thoughtful gifts, including fine skins, a little box full of gold, and some boxes of sugar to sell, but the biggest surprise came from my wife. She wrote that I had a son. The news was overwhelming. He was born 8 months after I left Brazil and had grown into a big man. He was eager to meet me. So many things had happened in such a short time, and it was shocking. I wanted to cry, then I wanted to laugh. The emotions were so intense that I couldn't calm down. I stood up, sat down, stood up again, and walked around the room, laughing and then crying. Once I calmed down a little, I began to think about what to do next. Chapter 31, Brazil. I thought about moving back to Brazil. I wanted to see my son, my wife, and my plantation again. After thinking for a while, I decided to go to Brazil, but only for a visit. I wanted to see if I could live there again. I wrote to my wife, asking her if it was okay for me to visit them for a few days, and included the letter. I sent nice presents to my wife and her father's family. After some time, I received a letter from my wife. She wrote that I was welcome to visit them, and her invitation made me very happy. I began planning another journey by sea, purchasing gifts for them. 2 weeks later, I was ready to go. When we arrived in Brazil, I was reunited with my wife and my son. She had changed a lot, but she was still very beautiful. My son was now a grown man. He was very intelligent and had his own family. He also had big responsibilities, managing plantations for the entire family and overseeing a vast amount of land. My son spoke only Portuguese and a little Spanish, but my Portuguese had become rusty over the years. I had forgotten many words and could only recall some basic phrases. However, with practice, I quickly regained my vocabulary. After 2 weeks, I was able to have basic conversations on many topics, and within a month, I could speak fluently and naturally again. I was so happy to be able to communicate with my wife and son. We had so much to talk about. Soon after my arrival in Brazil, we had a big party. It was a celebration of my son's birthday and also of my return to Brazil. Brazil had changed a lot as well. Many things were different from what I remembered. The plantations were much bigger, and many more people worked on them. I spent 3 months with my family. I knew I wasn't far from my island, and I began thinking about visiting it again. I wanted to spend a few days there. Friday also wanted to visit the island, and my son expressed interest in going as well. But I didn't think it was a good idea. I knew how dangerous the sea could be, but my son wanted to see the island that he had only heard about in my stories. We planned our journey, and 2 weeks later, we left Brazil. We boarded a ship heading to Havana, and I had made an agreement with the captain to stop at my island on the way there. When we arrived at the island, we met Friday's people, who now lived there. I asked them what had happened to the prisoners. "Did you eat them?" I asked. They told me they didn't eat Europeans, they only ate their enemies from other islands. They explained that when they came to the island, the prisoners were already dead. They had probably killed each other. I wanted to stay on the island, and my son did too. I asked the captain if he could pick us up on his way back, and he agreed. It was interesting to see so many people on the island, where I had lived alone for so many years. The people there were very happy, and Friday was happy too. He had met a woman he liked very much. However, with practice, I quickly regained my vocabulary. After 2 weeks, I was able to have basic conversations on many topics, and within a month, I could speak fluently and naturally again. I was so happy to be able to communicate with my wife and son. We had so much to talk about. Soon after my arrival in Brazil, we had a big party. It was a celebration of my son's birthday and also of my return to Brazil. Brazil had changed a lot as well. Many things were different from what I remembered. The plantations were much bigger, and many more people worked on them. I spent 3 months with my family. I knew I wasn't far from my island, and I began thinking about visiting it again. I wanted to spend a few days there. Friday also wanted to visit the island, and my son expressed interest in going as well. But I didn't think it was a good idea. I knew how dangerous the sea could be, but my son wanted to see the island that he had only heard about in my stories. We planned our journey, and 2 weeks later, we left Brazil. We boarded a ship heading to Havana, and I had made an agreement with the captain to stop at my island on the way there. When we arrived at the island, we met Friday's people, who now lived there. I asked them what had happened to the prisoners. "Did you eat them?" I asked. They told me they didn't eat Europeans, they only ate their enemies from other islands. They explained that when they came to the island, the prisoners were already dead. They had probably killed each other. I wanted to stay on the island, and my son did too. I asked the captain if he could pick us up on his way back, and he agreed. It was interesting to see so many people on the island, where I had lived alone for so many years. The people there were very happy, and Friday was happy too. He had met a woman he liked very much.